He couldn't speak, he couldn't move, but the doctors say he could hear every single word, every hushed conversation in that hallway, every phone call taken just outside the door, every whispered plan made between two people who believed he was gone, not just from the room, but from the world. He lay in that hospital bed like a man already buried, and the people who should have been weeping were already dividing what he'd built. Think about what that feels like. Your body betrays you completely. You cannot lift a finger. You cannot make a sound. But your mind is still there, fully lit, taking in every word, every laugh, every casual cruelty that the people closest to you no longer bother to hide. You are invisible, and you are witnessing everything. What Marcus Webb heard in those first 11 days would either destroy him or arm him. And the two people standing just outside his room had no idea which one they were handing him. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something. What you are about to hear is not just a story about a man in a hospital bed. It is a story about greed that was years in the making. It is a story about two people who thought they had been patient enough, careful enough, and clever enough to walk away from another man's life with everything he had ever earned. And it is a story about the single medical truth, one finding on one brain scan that unraveled all of it. Marcus Webb was 51 years old. He had built his company, Webb Meridian Group, from a rented warehouse in southeast Atlanta and a $12,000 loan his mother had taken, out against her own home. By the time he was admitted to St. Raphael's Medical Center in Atlanta on a Tuesday night in October, Webb Meridian was worth somewhere in the region of $40 million. He had never taken a sick day. He had never missed a board meeting. He had a photo of his mother on his desk that had sat in the same spot for 19 years. He was exactly the kind of man who you would never expect to end up in a hospital bed, fighting for his life, while the people he loved most counted the days. The attending neurologist on duty that night was Dr. Nia Caldwell. She had been working trauma and neurology at St. Raphael's for 11 years. She had seen hundreds of head injury cases. She knew the patterns. She knew what a fall looked like. She knew what blunt force trauma looked like. And when she reviewed Marcus Webb's brain scan at 4:17 in the morning, 3 hours after he had been brought in, she saw something that made her put her coffee down and go back to the beginning. What she found that night would take 11 more days to fully surface. But when it did, everything, every story that had been told, every alibi that had been offered, every plan that had been set in motion collapsed. By the end of this, you will know exactly what Dr. Caldwell found. You will know what Marcus heard from that hospital bed. You will know who was in that house the night he was found at the bottom of the stairs. And you will know how a man who could not speak, could not move, and could not even blink on command for the first 72 hours, managed to bring down the two people who had been standing over him and waiting. There are 3 moments in this story that changed everything. The first happened 6 weeks before anyone even suspected something was wrong. The second happens on the night of the accident itself, and only one person in that house truly knows what occurred. The third happens in a hospital room in almost complete silence, when a detective leans forward in a chair and asks a man who cannot speak a single yes or no question. These 3 moments are the spine of this story. Everything else is the flesh. The key people are these: Marcus Webb, the CEO, the builder, the man in the bed; Diane Webb, his wife of 14 years, a woman who by every outward measure was composed in a way that grief simply does not allow; Derek Okafor, a man Marcus had once called a business partner and a friend, who by the time of the accident had not been in Marcus's professional life for 2 years, yet was found in a hospital hallway in the middle of the night, laughing quietly near a vending machine while the man he had betrayed lay on a ventilator down the hall; and Dr. Nia Caldwell, who trusted what the scan told her and refused, twice, to be reassigned. There is a question at the center of this story that I want you to hold in your mind from the beginning all the way through to the end. At what point did Diane Webb stop grieving the life she had and start calculating the one she wanted? Because the answer to that question is not where you would expect to find it. It is not in a text message or a bank transfer or a secret phone. It is in the 6 weeks before October, in a file sitting in a downtown law office, in the instructions that Marcus Webb left with his attorney before he ever walked through his own front door that night. Marcus Webb was born in 1972 in the Mechanicsville neighborhood of Atlanta, Georgia. His mother, Loretta Webb, worked 2 jobs for most of his childhood: a day shift at a dry cleaner on Pryor Street, and an evening shift at a hotel laundry service out near the airport. His father was not in the picture. Marcus was the middle child of 3, and by his own account in a rare 2019 interview with a regional business journal, he describes his mother as the only person who never once made him feel like what he was trying to do was impossible. He studied business administration at Georgia State, worked nights at a freight logistics company to pay his tuition, and graduated in 1996 without a cent of debt because he had refused to carry any. He started Webb Meridian Group in 2001, the name a reference to a map term his mother had used once when he was young, telling him that a meridian was an imaginary line, but it still told you exactly where you were. He built the company around commercial real estate logistics, connecting property developers with freight and material suppliers across the Southeast. By 2010, he had 22 employees. By 2018, he had over 110. By the time of the accident, Webb Meridian was one of the most consistently profitable mid-size logistics firms in the region. His employees described him consistently in the same terms. He remembered names. He remembered children's names. He remembered anniversaries. His assistant of 9 years, a woman named Cynthia, told investigators that in all her time working for Marcus, she had never once seen him leave before the last person on his floor left. She also told them something else. Something she had hesitated over for months before she said it out loud. She said that in the 8 weeks before the accident, Marcus had seemed distracted in a way she had never seen before, not worried about the business. Something else. Something personal. She said he had started closing his office door during lunch, which he never did. She said he had started taking calls outside, in the parking structure, away from the building. He wasn't himself, she told them. But I didn't know what to do with that until it was too late. Marcus met Diane Holloway at a charity gala in Buckhead in 2007. She was 32. He was 35. By most accounts, she was extraordinary to be around. Quick, charming, socially fluent in a way that made rooms move toward her. She had a background in event planning and had parlayed it into a boutique consulting firm that organized corporate functions for Atlanta's professional class. She was exactly the kind of partner that a man building a company toward a certain level of visibility would be proud to have beside him. They married in 2010 after 3 years of dating. The ceremony was at a botanical garden in Piedmont Park. The photos are still publicly accessible on an old event blog. She is laughing in every single one of them. The early years of their marriage, by all available accounts, were genuinely warm. Colleagues who attended dinners at the Webb home described an easy, relaxed couple, one that balanced each other well. Marcus was quiet and careful. Diane was expressive and social. They traveled when his schedule allowed, preferred smaller gatherings over large parties, and shared a taste for mid-century modern architecture that showed clearly in the home they renovated together in the Cascade Heights neighborhood. There were 2 miscarriages in the first 4 years. Those who knew them well said it changed something in Diane, not loudly, not in any way that was immediately visible, but quietly, the way a hairline fracture changes a wall long before anyone can see it. By year 8 of the marriage, people who had been close to them in the early years noticed that the easy warmth had become something more formal. They still appeared at events together. They still maintained every outward signal of a solid marriage. But the closeness was gone. Marcus poured more of himself into the business. Diane's consulting work had slowed and she had no obvious reason to revive it. By 2020, those who knew them well described the marriage as comfortable, which, in the language of people who are being careful about what they say, typically means something that stopped working years ago but neither party has been willing to name. What nobody outside the marriage knew, and what Marcus had only confirmed to himself in the 6 weeks before October, was that Diane had been in a relationship with Derek Okafor for at least 8 months. Marcus had not confronted her. He had not said a word. He had hired a private investigator named Russell Tate, and he had waited. He had also, very quietly, contacted his estate attorney and asked to review his documents, not urgently, just to make sure everything was in order. That phrase, "make sure everything is in order," would later take on a meaning that none of them fully understood at the time. Derek Okafor had met Marcus Webb in 2015 through a mutual contact in Atlanta's commercial real estate community. They had briefly explored a business partnership around a warehouse development project in DeKalb County. The partnership dissolved in 2021 after a financial dispute that Marcus never discussed publicly, but that several colleagues described as a fallout over money that had not been accounted for. Marcus had absorbed the financial loss rather than pursue litigation. People who knew him said that was typical. He hated conflict more than he hated being wrong. After 2021, Derek Okafor had moved through several short-term consulting arrangements, none of which appeared to have generated significant income. By the time of the accident, Derek's financial picture was, by all indications, precarious, and that fact matters enormously to what comes next. On Tuesday, October 14th, Marcus Webb returned home from what Cynthia believed was a business trip to Charlotte. He had told her he would be back Thursday. He arrived home almost 48 hours early. No one at the office knew. His driver, who sometimes picked him up from the airport, was not called. Marcus took a rideshare. According to the app record recovered later, his pickup was from Hartsfield-Jackson at 7:04 p.m. He was dropped at the end of his street, not at his front door, at 7:58 p.m. Nobody could explain that detail at first. Why would a man getting a rideshare to his own home ask to be dropped at the end of the street? The investigators would later come to believe that Marcus Webb knew what he was returning to, and he had made a decision about how he wanted to enter that house. Diane called 911 at 9:23 p.m. The recording of that call has been reviewed by multiple investigators. The dispatcher described her voice as calm and measured. She said she had found her husband at the bottom of the staircase. She said she did not know how long he had been there. She said she had just come downstairs from the second floor. She said she had not heard anything. The first responders arrived at 9:31 p.m. They found Marcus Webb at the base of the main staircase in the front entryway of the home, unconscious, with a significant head wound. The staircase was 14 steps, hardwood, with a landing at the top. On first review, the scene was consistent with a fall. But one of the paramedics, a man named James Foote who had been working emergency services in Atlanta for 16 years, noticed something as they moved Marcus to the gurney. He noticed it and then he second-guessed himself, because the scene did not otherwise raise flags. He filed his report without mentioning it. He would come back to it later. What he noticed was the position of the body. In his experience, when a person falls down a staircase, particularly one that curves or turns, the body ends up in a way that reflects the direction of the fall. The distribution of injuries follows the physics. Marcus Webb's injuries were concentrated on the left side of his skull and upper neck, but the staircase in that house runs in a direction that, if a person fell naturally from the top, would put the primary impact on the back of the skull or the right side. It was a small detail. It was a detail that would take 11 days to become the center of everything. Marcus Webb was admitted to St. Raphael's Medical Center at 9:58 p.m. He had a severe traumatic brain injury, a subdural hematoma on the left side of his skull, elevated intracranial pressure, and 3 broken ribs on his left side consistent, according to the initial ER assessment, with the fall. He underwent emergency surgery to relieve the bleeding on the brain. He survived the surgery, but he did not wake up. He was placed in a medically induced coma to allow the swelling in his brain to reduce. Dr. Nia Caldwell reviewed his case the following morning. Dr. Nia Caldwell had spent 11 years in trauma neurology, and the thing she told the investigator later, the thing that stands out in every account of this case, is that she almost didn't say anything. She saw the anomaly in the scan. She reviewed the injury pattern. She thought about it for 3 days, she said, genuinely debating whether she was reading something that wasn't there. Because in medicine, you are trained to look for the most probable explanation, and the most probable explanation was a fall. A man at the top of a staircase. A misstep. The physics of gravity and a hard floor. What the scan told her, and what she eventually confirmed with a forensic neurology consult, she requested privately outside the official chain of his care, was that the injury pattern on Marcus Webb's skull was not consistent with a fall from a staircase. The primary impact point, the concentration of force, the angle of the fracture line in his skull, all of it was consistent with a single direct blow delivered from the left side while Marcus was either standing or kneeling. Not a fall, a strike. The difference, to anyone who knows what to look for in a brain scan, is not subtle. It is, in Dr. Caldwell's words to the investigator, unmistakable once you know what you're comparing it to. She went to hospital administration on day 3. She was told to document her concerns and submit them through the standard reporting process. She did that. She was then, on day 5, informed that her caseload was being adjusted and that another attending neurologist would be assigned to Marcus Webb's care going forward. Dr. Caldwell refused the reassignment. She requested a formal explanation in writing. The administration did not provide one. She then contacted the Fulton County Medical Examiner's office directly, flagged the case as a potential criminal matter, and submitted her scan analysis and the forensic consult report. The medical examiner notified the Atlanta Police Department, and on day 8, while Diane Webb was already making calls about operational control of Webb Meridian Group, 2 detectives arrived at St. Raphael's to review the case. Here is what the medical record shows about Marcus Webb's neurological state in those first 11 days. He was placed in a medically induced coma for the first 4 days to reduce the intracranial pressure. When the coma was reversed on day 5, he showed no voluntary motor response. He did not open his eyes. He did not respond to pain stimuli in the standard way. The clinical picture was consistent with what neurologists call a vegetative state, a condition in which the brainstem continues to function and the body maintains basic autonomic processes, but higher consciousness appears absent. His family was told there was significant uncertainty about his prognosis. What the medical record does not show, because there was no way to measure it at the time, is what Marcus Webb was actually experiencing in those first 11 days. We know now from Marcus himself that he was conscious from approximately day 6 onward. Not fully, not continuously. More like surfacing and submerging, he described it later, like coming up through dark water and then being pulled back down. But the conversations he heard in those periods of awareness were real. He retained them. He would later be able to recount them in specific, verifiable detail, and what he heard in those 11 days became a central part of the criminal investigation. He heard Diane on the phone. He recognized her voice. He could not open his eyes fully, but there were moments when he could perceive light and shadow through his eyelids. He heard her tell someone that the doctors were not optimistic, a phrase that he told investigators did not match anything the doctors had actually said to her in those first days. He heard her mention a property in the Buckhead area that he had not discussed with her. He heard a man's voice in the room on day 9, a voice he recognized immediately. Derek Okafor stood in that room, he told investigators, for approximately 4 minutes. He did not speak to Marcus directly. He spoke to Diane. Marcus heard him say, "What's the latest?" He heard Diane reply, "Same." It could still go either way. He heard Derek say, "We need to move before the end of the month." Then they left. Before we go deeper into what the investigators found, I want to pause here and just acknowledge what it means to be that man in that bed. The documented medical literature on locked-in syndrome and covert consciousness in minimally conscious states is extensive and sobering. In the case of Gil Avni, an Israeli patient who experienced a form of locked-in syndrome and later fully recovered, he was able to recall and precisely cite conversations that had taken place around him during his hospitalization. Conversations that the people who had them assumed he could not hear. Avni's doctors later confirmed the accuracy of what he reported. The experience, as described by patients who have recovered from similar states, is one of complete isolation inside a body that has become a prison. Hearing everything, unable to respond, unable to signal, unable to stop what is unfolding, just out of reach. What Marcus Webb endured in those 11 days is not something that any summary can fully capture. On day 8, as the detectives were reviewing Dr. Caldwell's findings at the hospital, Marcus Webb's attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had represented Marcus for 12 years, walked into the Atlanta Police Department's downtown precinct with a sealed envelope. He had been holding it for 11 days. Marcus had given it to him 3 weeks before the accident. The instruction Marcus had left with Gerald Fitch was simple and, in retrospect, heartbreaking in its foresight. "If anything happens to me, open this and take it where it needs to go." Gerald Fitch had not opened the envelope before arriving at the precinct. He opened it in front of the detectives. Inside the envelope was a file compiled by Russell Tate, the private investigator Marcus had retained 6 weeks before the accident. The file contained photographs, dates, locations, and phone records. It documented a relationship between Diane Webb and Derek Okafor that had been ongoing for at least 8 months. It showed the two of them at a property in Sandy Springs on 11 separate occasions. A property investigators later confirmed that was listed under a shell company with Derek Okafor's initials in the LLC registration. It contained screenshots of communications between Diane and Derek that referenced, In terms that were careful but not careful enough, their awareness of Marcus's financial and estate situation, including the life insurance policy that Diane had updated 6 months prior. But the file contained one additional piece of information that the investigators had not expected. Russell Tate had discovered, through his own inquiry into Derek Okafor's recent financial activity, that Derek had, over a period of approximately 14 months, been systematically passing proprietary client data from Webb Meridian Group to a competing logistic firm operating out of Nashville. The data included client contracts, pricing structures, and forward projection models. Marcus had not yet acted on this information at the time of the accident. He had confirmed it to Tate the week before he died. The estimated financial damage to Webb Meridian from the data leak was later assessed at somewhere between $2 and $3 million. So now the picture that the investigators were looking at was no longer simply a domestic betrayal. It was a betrayal that had financial dimensions going back more than a year. Two people who stood to benefit from Marcus Webb's death. One through a life insurance policy, the other through the continued looting of his company, were now directly implicated in circumstances that a neurologist had already flagged as a potential assault. The medical finding and the investigator's file had arrived at the precinct within 48 hours of each other. The detectives assigned to the case described the moment of connecting those two pieces as, quote, one of those times in this job where the whole room goes quiet. On day 11, Marcus Webb showed the first signs of motor response. It was small, a twitch in the fingers of his right hand that a nurse named Danielle noticed during a routine vital check at 6:40 in the morning. She did not dismiss it. She documented it and flagged it immediately for Dr. Caldwell, who by that point had been formally reinstated to Marcus's care following the police inquiry. Dr. Caldwell spent 2 hours with Marcus that morning, working through a careful, incremental neurological assessment. What she confirmed by mid-morning was something that rewrote the clinical picture entirely. Marcus was not in a vegetative state. He had likely been in a minimally conscious state for several days, possibly longer. He was aware. He was oriented. He understood language, and he could respond not with words, not with movement, but with his eyes. One deliberate downward blink for no, two for yes. The investigating detective, a man named Raymond Price who had been working homicide and major crimes in Atlanta for 19 years, arrived at St. Raphael's that afternoon. Dr. Caldwell briefed him on the communication system they had established with Marcus. Detective Price sat beside the bed. He did not rush. He did not lead. He began with orientation questions, his name, the year, confirming that Marcus understood the system. Marcus answered correctly every time. Then Detective Price leaned forward in his chair and asked the question that the entire case had been building toward. He said, "Mr. Webb, did you fall down those stairs?" The room was silent. The heart monitor kept its rhythm, and Marcus Webb blinked once. Slowly, deliberately, one blink, no. Detective Price asked a second question. "Were you struck?" 2 blinks, yes. A third question. "Was there another person in the house that night?" 2 blinks, yes. The detective looked at Dr. Caldwell. He then asked Marcus a fourth question, one that required more than a yes or a no. He pointed to a board that Dr. Caldwell had prepared, showing letters of the alphabet. He told Marcus he was going to move his finger along the letters, and to blink when he reached the right one. It took 40 minutes. Marcus spelled 2 words. Detectives do not typically describe moments in their cases as moments that made them emotional. Detective Price, in his written account of that interview, used the word devastating. The 2 words Marcus spelled were a name, the name of the person who had been in the house that night. Before we continue, I want to do something we do on this channel whenever a story reaches a point like this one. I want to hear from you, because stories like Marcus Webb's do not exist in isolation. They happen inside communities, inside families, inside marriages that look completely normal from the outside. So before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let's get back to what the investigators found. Detective Price moved quickly after the interview. Search warrants were executed on the Webb family home, on the Sandy Springs property associated with Derek Okafor's shell company, and on financial accounts linked to both Diane Webb and Derek Okafor. But the development that shifted the case from serious to overwhelming came not from any of those searches. It came from a toxicology request that Marcus Webb's attorney Gerald Fitch had quietly submitted on day 3, not through the hospital's standard process, but directly through a private laboratory, using a blood sample drawn on the night of admission that the hospital had retained as part of its standard trauma protocol. Gerald Fitch had submitted that request before the police were ever involved. He had done it because, in his 12 years of knowing Marcus Webb, he had one standing instruction from his client. If I am ever hospitalized under circumstances that are not immediately clear, have my blood independently analyzed before anything else happens. Marcus had given him that instruction in writing 2 years prior, following an unrelated legal matter that had made him cautious about institutional procedures. It was the kind of instruction that most people give their attorneys and then forget about. It was the kind of instruction that, in this case, made all the difference. The private toxicology report came back on day 9. It identified the presence of a sedative compound, a benzodiazepine, specifically at a concentration in Marcus Webb's blood that was inconsistent with anything administered during his emergency treatment or surgery. The compound had been in his system before he arrived at the hospital. The estimated administration window, based on the metabolite breakdown, was between 2 and 4 hours before the 911 call. Marcus Webb had not been prescribed any benzodiazepine. He had no history of using any such medication. Somebody had administered it to him. The most probable method, given the timeline and the circumstances, was through food or drink consumed at home earlier that evening. When Detective Price received the private toxicology report alongside the results of the police search warrants, which had identified, among other items, a prescription bottle of a benzodiazepine at the Sandy Springs property registered to Derek Okafor, prescribed under a name that investigators flagged as potentially fraudulent. The outline of what had happened on October 14th became, for the first time, clear. Marcus Webb had come home to a house where he had been expected to be gone for 2 more days. He had been, to some degree, physically impaired by the time the confrontation occurred. Sedated enough to affect his balance and coordination, but not enough to render him unconscious outright. There had been another person in that house, and the injury to his skull was not from any staircase. Diane Webb and Derek Okafor were arrested on the morning of day 14, 3 days after. Marcus had provided his blink testimony, and 2 days after the toxicology and search warrant results had been consolidated into a criminal complaint. Diane was taken into custody at the Webb family home, where she had continued to reside throughout the investigation. Derek Okafor was taken into custody at the Sandy Springs property. Neither of them had any indication, according to the arresting officers, that the arrest was coming. Diane Webb's attorney later stated publicly that his client maintained her innocence. Derek Okafor's attorney made a similar statement. Neither statement has since been elaborated upon in any public filing. The charges filed against both Diane Webb and Derek Okafor included aggravated assault, criminal attempt to commit murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and, in Derek Okafor's case, additional charges related to the corporate data theft from Webb Meridian Group, the life insurance policy Diane had updated 6 months prior. A policy worth $3 million was immediately flagged and suspended pending the criminal proceedings. The corporate sale that Derek had been positioning for Webb Meridian Group, which would have transferred ownership of the company to the Nashville competitor that had been receiving his stolen data, was blocked the same day. Webb Meridian Group remained intact. Marcus Webb was transferred to a rehabilitation facility in December, 7 weeks after the accident. His recovery was slow and, by any honest account, incomplete. He regained speech over several months. First words, then sentences, then full conversations, though he continues to describe occasional gaps in his fluency. His mobility returned incrementally. By the following spring, he was walking with assistance. By summer, he was walking unassisted. He has not returned to the daily operational role at Webb Meridian Group, but his name remains on the door. The company is being run by a leadership team he personally selected during his rehabilitation. His mother's photograph is still on the desk. He gave one public statement, released through Gerald Fitch's office in the spring following the arrest. It was 6 sentences long. He thanked Dr. Nia Caldwell. He thanked Nurse Danielle and the staff at St. Raphael's. He thanked Detective Price. He did not mention Diane. He did not mention Derek. The last sentence of the statement read, "I built this company because I believe that what you build with honesty cannot be taken from you. I still believe that." And then he went quiet, and has remained so. There are 100 ways to tell a story like this one. You could tell it as a crime story, And it is one. You could tell it as a business story, and the corporate angle alone is a full documentary. You could tell it as a medical story, and Dr. Nia Caldwell's decision to refuse reassignment and go directly to the medical examiner's office is, in itself, a story worth telling in full. But the thing that stays with me, the thing I find myself returning to, is the image of Marcus Webb in that hospital bed on day 6, surfacing into consciousness in a body that would not respond to him, hearing the voices of the 2 people who had tried to end his life, and having absolutely nothing he could do about it. Nothing except remember. That is what this story is, ultimately. It is a story about memory, about the stubborn, irreducible fact that a man's mind did not go dark when his body did, about the way that one doctor, one private investigator, one attorney, and one nurse who noticed a twitch in a set of fingers at 6:40 in the morning each held one piece of something that Marcus Webb could not hold himself. And together, without ever being in the same room at the same time, they handed him back his life. The question that I keep turning over, and I want you to think about this as you go into the comments, is not whether what Diane and Derek did was evil. That part is not complicated. The question is, what does it take for a person to look at someone they once loved, someone who built something extraordinary, someone who is lying in a hospital bed unable to defend themselves, and see not a human being in pain, but an obstacle that needs to be removed? What happens inside a person that makes that possible? I genuinely do not know the answer. But I think the fact that it is a hard question, the fact that most of us cannot easily imagine crossing that line, is the most important thing about it. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear from you. And if this story moved you, if you found yourself sitting with it, turning it over, wanting to understand how something like this happens inside what looked like an ordinary life, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Hit subscribe and come back, because the next story we are covering involves a woman who spent 17 years being told she had imagined everything, and the single document that proved she had been right all along. You do not want to miss it.